It was a serene afternoon at Rosewood Café, the kind of place where time seemed to slow down. Tucked away on a quiet street lined with blooming jacarandas, the café was known for its charm: wicker chairs, wooden tables, and the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafting through the air. Inside, sunlight filtered through lace curtains, creating a warm, golden glow. Conversations were hushed, like secrets being exchanged, and every now and then, the soft clink of a coffee cup would punctuate the quiet. At the corner table, near a window overlooking the sleepy street, sat Nathan Cole. A tall, wiry man with streaks of silver in his hair, he blended effortlessly into the background. His face was lean, his features sharp but softened by a calm demeanor. Dressed in a faded leather jacket and worn jeans, he looked like just another passerby taking a break from the world outside. No one gave him a second glance. Why would they? Nathan seemed ordinary, unremarkable, even a man sipping a cappuccino while watching the world go by. Yet, if anyone had looked closely, they might have noticed the sharpness in his gaze. His eyes, a piercing gray, darted from one passerby to another, scanning the street with a quiet intensity. He wasn't just observing, he was assessing, cataloging every detail: the rhythm of footsteps, the hum of distant traffic, the sound of a dog barking faintly in the distance. Nathan Cole wasn't ordinary, not by a long shot. A retired Special Forces operative, he had spent decades in the shadows, operating in places most people couldn't even imagine. His work had taken him to the darkest corners of the world, where chaos reigned and survival was never guaranteed. But that life was behind him now. At least, that's what he told himself. Rosewood Café was his sanctuary, a place where he could sit quietly and let the weight of his past fall away, even if just for a while. He had chosen this small, unassuming town for its peace, far removed from the noise and turmoil he had once known. Here, he could enjoy the simple things: good coffee, the rustling of leaves, the laughter of children playing in the park across the street. And yet, even in this peaceful haven, an old instinct gnawed at him, a sixth sense honed over years in the field. It wasn't something he could turn off, no matter how hard he tried. It was like a low hum at the back of his mind, a quiet warning that trouble was near. Nathan took another sip of his coffee, his grip on the ceramic cup steady but firm. His gaze shifted to the reflection in the glass window beside him. He could see the cafe behind him, the barista wiping down the counter, a young couple chatting softly at a table, and an older man reading a newspaper in the corner. Everything appeared normal. Still, Nathan couldn't shake the feeling. His instincts had saved his life more times than he could count. They had guided him through ambushes, betrayals, and near impossible missions. And now, sitting in this tranquil cafe, they whispered to him again. The air felt different, thicker, heavier somehow. He noticed it in the way the conversation seemed to dip into silence for a moment too long, in the way a shadow lingered outside the window before disappearing around the corner. He set his cup down carefully, the soft clink almost drowned out by the cafe's ambient noise. His hands, though relaxed, were ready, always ready. He shifted slightly in his seat, giving himself a clear view of the door without drawing attention. Relax, he told himself quietly, though the word felt hollow. Nathan's past had trained him to see threats where others saw none. A parked car with its engine still running, a man loitering too long near a street lamp, a sound that didn't belong. These were the signs he had learned to recognize. Sometimes they meant nothing. Sometimes they meant everything. He let his eyes drift back to the street outside. A delivery truck rumbled past, its tires crunching on the pavement. A young boy pedaled his bike down the sidewalk, his laughter ringing out as his dog trotted beside him. An older woman carrying a shopping bag paused to adjust her hat, glancing briefly into the cafe window before moving on. Nathan exhaled slowly. Maybe it was just habit. Maybe his mind was playing tricks on him, searching for patterns where there were none. After all, he had spent years in high-stakes situations, where every decision was a matter of life and death. It wasn't easy to let that go. But the feeling persisted, a quiet tension that refused to fade. As he reached for his coffee again, the door to the cafe creaked open. Nathan's eyes flicked up instinctively. Two men walked in, their boots thudding heavily against the wooden floor. They were young, dressed in leather jackets with patches sewn onto the sleeves. Bikers, Nathan noted, their movements deliberate but slightly uncoordinated, like they were trying too hard to appear casual. The men exchanged a glance, their eyes scanning the room. Nathan's fingers tightened around his cup, his posture remaining relaxed. He didn't stare, he didn't need to. A quick peripheral glance was enough. The taller of the two had a jagged scar running down his cheek, his face hardened into a permanent scowl. The other, stockier and slightly younger, had restless hands that fidgeted with the zipper of his jacket. They weren't locals. Nathan could tell by the way they stood, their boots leaving a faint trail of road dust on the polished floor. He could tell by the way they looked around, their eyes lingering on the cash register and the patrons, sizing them up. And he could tell by the way the atmosphere in the cafe shifted, a subtle change in the air as the other customers grew quiet, their unease almost palpable. Nathan's sixth sense sharpened, the hum in his mind growing louder. Trouble was near. He stayed still, his breathing steady, his heart rate unchanged. If the men were here to cause a scene, they had no idea what they were walking into. Nathan Cole may have been retired, but he wasn't defenseless. Not by a long shot. Nathan didn't like to assume the worst about people. Years of service had taught him the value of observing first and acting only when absolutely necessary. He had seen enough violence to last a lifetime, and the last thing he wanted was to add to it. But experience had also taught him that ignoring his instincts was often a costly mistake. The two men who had just entered weren't there for coffee or conversation. That much was clear. The taller man, Scarface, scanned the room with narrowed eyes. He had the look of someone who thought he owned every space he walked into, his swagger exaggerated to mask something deeper: fear, perhaps, or insecurity. His partner, Fidget, was less composed, his eyes darting nervously between tables as his fingers toyed with his jacket zipper. They weren't just bikers passing through town. They had a purpose. Nathan's gaze remained fixed on the street outside, but his senses were tuned to the men's every move. He noticed the way Scarface's boots scuffed slightly as he walked, a heavy tread that spoke of a man used to intimidation. He noted the faint bulge under Fidget's jacket, a weapon, most likely a knife. The cafe's patrons, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, grew quieter. The couple at the table near the door exchanged uneasy glances. The barista hesitated mid-motion, her hand frozen on the espresso machine. Even the man reading the newspaper in the corner lowered it slightly, his eyes peeking over the edge to watch the newcomers. Scarface strode to the counter, leaning against it with a casualness that felt forced. He gave the barista a once-over, his lips curling into a smirk. "Nice place you got here," he drawled, his voice loud enough to command attention. The barista, a young woman in her early 20s, managed a tight smile. "Thank you. Can I get you something?" Scarface chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "Yeah. How about the register?" A ripple of fear passed through the room. The barista's smile faltered, her eyes widening as she took a half step back. Nathan set his cup down, the soft clink almost inaudible over the tension in the air. He didn't turn around, not yet. Instead, he shifted slightly in his seat, angling himself for a better view of the scene reflected in the window. Fidget stepped closer to the counter, his movements jittery. "Hurry it up," he muttered, his voice higher pitched than he probably intended. The barista hesitated, glancing nervously at the customers. Scarface noticed and leaned further over the counter, his smirk twisting into a snarl. "Don't look at them. Look at me. Open the register, or things get ugly." Nathan's fingers tapped lightly against the table, a slow, deliberate rhythm. He wasn't a fan of unnecessary heroics. There was no point in getting involved in something unless you were sure it was the right move. But this wasn't just a robbery. It was a test. Scarface wasn't after money, he was after control. Nathan had seen men like him before, bullies who thrived on fear, who fed off the power they felt when others cowered. And then there was Fidget, the nervous sidekick whose bravado was as thin as the leather jacket he wore. Nathan weighed his options. He could wait, see how things played out, hope someone else intervened. Or he could act now and take control of the situation before it spiraled further. The barista's hands shook as she reached for the register. Scarface grinned, satisfied with her compliance. "That's more like it," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Stop," Nathan said, his voice calm but commanding. The single word cut through the tension like a knife. Every head in the room turned toward him, including Scarface and Fidget. Scarface straightened, his smirk fading as he focused on the man sitting at the corner table. "What'd you say?" Nathan finally turned, his gray eyes meeting Scarface's with an intensity that made the other man falter for a split second. "I said stop," Nathan repeated, his tone steady. "Leave the register alone, pay for your coffee if you're actually here for one, and walk out. Now." Scarface's eyes narrowed, and his lips curled into a sneer. "And who the hell are you to tell me what to do?" Nathan didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood slowly, his movements deliberate. He wasn't a large man, but there was something about the way he carried himself, calm, controlled, and completely unafraid, that made him seem larger than life. The room seemed to shrink around him as he stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and the two intruders. "I'm the guy giving you a chance to walk away before you do something you'll regret," Nathan said quietly. Scarface laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You've got guts, old man. I'll give you that. But you're making a big mistake." Nathan tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "I've made plenty of mistakes in my life. Standing up to bullies like you has never been one of them." Fidget shifted nervously, glancing between Scarface and Nathan. "Boss, maybe we should." "Shut up," Scarface snapped, cutting him off. He turned back to Nathan, his eyes blazing with anger. "You've got no idea who you're messing with." Nathan's lips twitched, almost imperceptibly a smile. "A warning?" "Neither do you." The room was deathly silent, the tension so thick it was almost tangible. Scarface's hand twitched toward his waistband, but Nathan's eyes caught the movement before it could fully form. "Don't," Nathan said, his voice like steel. Scarface hesitated, his bravado faltering under the weight of Nathan's gaze. For the first time, he seemed to realize that the man standing before him wasn't just another bystander. The air crackled with unspoken threats, and Nathan could feel the weight of every eye in the room on him. This wasn't the confrontation he had sought, but it was one he couldn't walk away from, not without making a statement. The tranquility outside Rosewood Café shattered like glass. The low, guttural roar of motorcycle engines tore through the peaceful afternoon, growing louder as they approached. Heads turned, curious at first, but curiosity quickly gave way to unease as the source came into view. 6 bikers rolled into the narrow street, their powerful machines rumbling like an approaching storm. The leader rode at the front, a burly man whose skull tattoo crawled up his neck and disappeared under the edge of a leather vest. Behind him, the others followed in formation, their faces a mix of cocky grins and hard glares. The bikers parked haphazardly along the curb, their engines idling for a few seconds longer than necessary, as if to announce their arrival. The street, once bustling with quiet activity, seemed to hold its breath. A young woman walking her dog crossed to the other side of the road. An elderly man paused mid-step, pretending to check his watch but clearly watching them from the corner of his eye. Inside the cafe, the hum of conversation died abruptly as the gang began dismounting their bikes. Nathan Cole's sharp eyes flicked up from his coffee cup to the window. He didn't need long to size them up. The leader, Skullneck, was big, both in height and build, with a swagger that screamed arrogance. He wore heavy boots that thudded against the pavement as he walked, and his sleeveless vest revealed muscular arms covered in faded tattoos. His companions were less intimidating but no less threatening, men who followed him not because of loyalty but because of fear or a shared sense of power. Nathan's gaze moved quickly but methodically. He noted the weapons, knives tucked into boots, the unmistakable bulge of a gun holstered at one man's side, the chain wrapped around another's fist like a makeshift brass knuckle. They were trying to look casual, but the tension in their shoulders gave them away. This wasn't just a casual pit stop. The bell above the cafe door jingled harshly as Skullneck shoved it open and stepped inside, his presence like a dark cloud descending on the room. The rest of the gang followed, spreading out slightly as if to stake their claim on the space. Nathan didn't move. He remained seated at his corner table, his posture relaxed and his fingers loosely wrapped around his coffee cup. To the untrained eye, he looked unbothered, even indifferent. But his senses were sharp, attuned to every sound, every movement, every shift in the air. "Hey, old man." Skullneck's voice cut through the silence, loud and abrasive. His beady eyes locked onto Nathan, the challenge clear. "That's our table you're sitting at?" Nathan's gray eyes met Skullneck's without hesitation. He didn't flinch, didn't blink. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Plenty of tables," Nathan said, his tone calm but firm. "Find another." The cafe grew eerily quiet, the tension thick and suffocating. Some of the other patrons exchanged nervous glances, their unease evident. A young couple near the counter quickly gathered their belongings and slipped out, while the barista froze mid-motion, her hand hovering over the coffee machine. For a moment, Skullneck said nothing, as if he couldn't believe what he'd just heard. Then he laughed a loud, guttural sound that made the windows rattle slightly. The laughter didn't reach his eyes, which remained cold and calculating. "You've got guts, old man," he sneered, taking a step closer. "Shame they won't do you any good." Nathan didn't reply. He simply set his cup down with a quiet clink, his movements measured and deliberate. The rest of the gang watched intently, their smirks growing wider. One of them, a wiry man with a patchy beard, leaned against the counter and grabbed a handful of sugar packets, tearing them open one by one and dumping the contents onto the floor. Another, a shorter man with a scar across his nose, pulled out a knife and began twirling it lazily between his fingers. The air was electric, heavy with anticipation. It wasn't just a question of if a confrontation would happen, it was a matter of when. Skullneck leaned over Nathan's table, his large hands resting on the edge as he loomed over him. "You don't seem to understand how things work around here," he said, his voice low and menacing. "When we walk in, people move. They show respect. You don't want to respect us." Nathan's gaze didn't waver. His calm, steady presence seemed to unnerve Skullneck, though the biker would never admit it. "I don't want trouble," Nathan said finally, his voice even. "But I don't run from it either." The words hung in the air like a challenge. For a split second, Skullneck hesitated. There was something in Nathan's eyes, something unyielding, something dangerous. It wasn't the look of a man bluffing or posturing. It was the look of someone who had seen more than Skullneck could imagine, someone who wasn't afraid. Scarno snorted, breaking the silence. "You hear this guy? Thinks he's some kind of tough guy." The others chuckled, their laughter uneasy but growing bolder as Skullneck grinned, regaining his composure. "I like you, old man," Skullneck said, straightening up. "You've got spirit. Too bad it won't save you." He turned slightly, signaling to his crew with a tilt of his head. That was all it took. Patchy Beard knocked over a chair, the loud crash making the barista flinch. Scarno's knife stopped twirling and pointed directly at Nathan, while another biker kicked over a nearby table, sending plates and cups shattering to the floor. Nathan remained seated, his calm demeanor unshaken as chaos erupted around him. His fingers rested lightly on the edge of the table, his body loose but ready. "You really don't want to do this," Nathan said quietly, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. Skullneck laughed again, louder this time, his confidence growing with each passing second. "Oh, I think we do," he said, reaching for the back of Nathan's chair. "And you're going to wish you'd." Before he could finish the sentence, Nathan moved. It was subtle at first, a shift of weight, a slight turn of the wrist, but the effect was immediate. In a blur of motion, Nathan's hand shot up, grabbing Skullneck's wrist and twisting it sharply. The biker yelped in pain, his grip on the chair faltering as Nathan rose to his feet in one fluid motion. The room seemed to freeze, every eye locked on the unfolding scene. Nathan released Skullneck's wrist and stepped back, his expression calm but his posture unmistakably commanding. "Walk away," he said again, his voice firm. But Skullneck wasn't the type to back down, especially not in front of his crew. He gritted his teeth, rubbing his wrist as he glared at Nathan. "You're going to regret that, old man." The gang moved as one, their earlier bravado now a full-blown threat. And Nathan Cole, retired Special Forces operative, prepared to show them exactly who they were dealing with. Skullneck's glare hardened, the sting of embarrassment evident on his face. The cafe's walls seemed to close in, the tension suffocating as his gang shifted uneasily, their loyalty demanding they act. For Nathan, the moment dragged like slow thunder, his instincts fine-tuned to the slightest motion. Scarnose stepped forward, his knife gleaming under the dim cafe lights. "You think you're some kind of hero?" he snarled, pointing the blade toward Nathan. "We've dealt with tougher guys than you." Nathan's gaze flicked briefly to the knife. Calmly, he said, "That's not a weapon. It's a liability." Scarnose blinked, confused, but before he could respond, Nathan shifted his stance. With a movement almost too fast to follow, Nathan stepped inside the knife's reach, grabbed Scarnose's wrist, and twisted. The knife clattered to the floor, spinning harmlessly under a nearby table. Scarnose yelped, clutching his hand as Nathan released him and took a step back. The gang froze, momentarily stunned. It wasn't just the speed of Nathan's reaction, it was the precision. The kind of precision that spoke of years of training, of experience far beyond anything they'd encountered. "You've got to be kidding me," Patchybeard muttered, his bravado faltering. But Skullneck wasn't about to let one of his men be humiliated without retaliation. "What are you waiting for?" he growled at his crew. "Take him." The gang sprang into action. The first man lunged, a hulking figure with a chain wrapped around his fist. He swung wildly, the chain cutting through the air with a metallic hiss. Nathan sidestepped smoothly, his movements economical and deliberate. He grabbed the man's arm mid-swing, used his momentum against him, and sent him crashing into a nearby table. Plates and cups shattered on impact, and the man groaned, struggling to get up. Another biker, a wiry figure with a shaved head, tried to tackle Nathan from behind. Nathan anticipated the move, twisting his body to deflect the attack. He grabbed the biker's collar and yanked him forward, sending him sprawling onto the floor. The remaining three hesitated, their earlier confidence replaced by uncertainty. The cafe was in disarray, tables overturned, broken glass scattered across the floor, and their comrades groaning in pain. Skullneck snarled in frustration. "What are you waiting for? He's just one guy." Nathan's calm voice cut through the chaos. "You should listen to your instincts and leave. Now." The gang exchanged uneasy glances. Skullneck, however, was too consumed by his bruised ego to back down. He pulled a gun from his waistband, the black metal gleaming ominously. The cafe patrons gasped, some ducking under tables, others frozen in fear. Nathan didn't flinch. His eyes locked on the weapon, calculating. Pulling a gun in a crowded cafe, he said, his voice steady. That's not just reckless. It's stupid. Skullneck sneered, aiming the gun at Nathan. You think you're smart, don't you? Let's see how tough you are now. Nathan's posture didn't change, but his tone grew colder. You've already lost. Walk away before you make it worse. For a moment, it seemed like Skullneck might listen. But then, with a growl of frustration, he tightened his grip on the gun. Nathan moved. It was a blur of motion, a twist of his body, a precise strike to Skullneck's wrist, and the gun was out of his hand, skittering across the floor. Nathan followed up with a sharp shove, sending Skullneck stumbling backward into one of his men. The gang's confidence crumbled. Without their leader's weapon, the power dynamic shifted. They were no longer predators, they were prey, facing someone they didn't understand and couldn't predict. Nathan stood tall, his expression calm but his presence commanding. Pick up your friends, he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. And leave. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, Patchy Beard helped Scarnose to his feet. The man with the chain groaned as another biker pulled him up, and the wiry one staggered to his feet, rubbing his bruised shoulder. Skullneck glared at Nathan, his pride wounded beyond repair. This isn't over, he spat, his voice venomous. Nathan's eyes narrowed. It is if you're smart. The bikers hesitated, their fear palpable. Finally, Skullneck snarled a command. Let's go. The gang shuffled out of the cafe, their bravado shattered. The roar of their motorcycles echoed briefly before fading into the distance, leaving behind an eerie silence. Nathan glanced around the cafe. The patrons were still frozen, their faces a mix of awe and disbelief. Slowly, they began to stir. The barista, her hands trembling, started picking up the shattered pieces of a coffee cup. Is everyone okay? Nathan asked, his tone gentle but firm. A few people nodded, their expressions grateful but wary. The young couple who had slipped out earlier peeked back through the window, their eyes wide. Nathan retrieved his coffee cup from the floor, set it on the table, and surveyed the room one last time. His calm demeanor belied the storm that had just passed, but his mind was already working. Trouble didn't just appear out of nowhere. And if the gang thought they could return for revenge, they would quickly learn just how wrong they were. Skullneck's grip tightened on the chair, his knuckles turning white. His gang spread out, encircling Nathan like a pack of wolves closing in on a lone target. The tension was palpable, every eye in the cafe glued to the unfolding confrontation. Nathan's senses sharpened, each detail registering with clarity. The rookie biker's hands fidgeted near his sides, brushing against the handle of a knife tucked into his belt. Another biker, bulkier and slower, stood near the counter, eyeing the cash register while muttering under his breath. The air reeked of cheap leather, motor oil, and arrogance. You've got guts, I'll give you that, Skullneck continued, his voice dripping with menace. But guts won't help you here. Do yourself a favor and leave before this gets ugly. Nathan's expression remained impassive, his voice low but firm. You don't own me, and you don't own this cafe. Take your gang and walk away while you still can. Skullneck let out a bark of laughter, but the sound lacked humor. You're a funny guy. Too bad I don't like jokes. He leaned in closer, his breath hot and foul. Do you know what happens to people who stand up to us? Nathan leaned back slightly, his calm demeanor unshaken. They usually win. The rookie biker shifted uneasily, his eyes darting between Skullneck and Nathan. Boss, maybe we shouldn't. Shut up, Luke. Skullneck barked, turning to glare at the younger man. I don't pay you to think. The small exchange wasn't lost on Nathan. The rookie wasn't fully committed to the gang's way of life. There was hesitation, even fear, in his eyes. Nathan filed this away, knowing it might come in handy. A small crash from behind the counter drew everyone's attention. The barista, trembling visibly, had dropped a glass. She quickly bent down to pick it up, but her hands were shaking too much to grip the shards. Nathan's gaze flicked to her for a brief second. He could see the terror etched across her face, the way her shoulders hunched as if bracing for a blow. This wasn't just a random visit from a rowdy gang. These bikers had terrorized this place before. "You've done this before," Nathan said, his tone as casual as if he were commenting on the weather. Skullneck turned back to him, his smirk returning. "What's it to you, old man?" Nathan tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "It tells me you're predictable. And predictable means easy to beat." The air in the cafe grew heavier. The gang shifted uncomfortably, the rookie paling further. Skullneck's smirk twisted into a snarl. "You've got a big mouth," he growled. "Let's see if you can back it up." One of the bikers lunged, his meaty fist aiming for Nathan's face. Nathan moved like water, fluid and effortless. He ducked under the swing, his chair scraping lightly against the floor as he stood. In the same motion, he stepped forward and delivered a sharp elbow strike to the biker's ribs. The man doubled over with a grunt, stumbling back into the counter. The cafe erupted into chaos. Another biker came at Nathan, a chain swinging in wide arcs. Nathan sidestepped, catching the chain mid-swing and yanking it hard. The biker stumbled forward, off balance, and Nathan sent him crashing into a table with a well-placed shove. Skullneck's face contorted with rage. "Get him, you idiots," he roared. Nathan moved with calculated precision, his every motion deliberate. He didn't waste energy on unnecessary movements, each strike and block executed with surgical accuracy. He used the environment to his advantage, sidestepping around tables and counters, keeping the gang from surrounding him completely. As the fight raged, Nathan's military training became increasingly evident. His movements weren't just fast, they were practiced, honed through years of experience in situations far more dangerous than this. The rookie biker hesitated on the sidelines, his hand hovering near his knife but never fully committing to the fight. His eyes darted around the room, taking in the chaos and the ease with which Nathan dismantled his comrades. Nathan noticed the hesitation, filing it away once again. He didn't have time to address it now, but it was a crack in the gang's armor, a crack he could exploit if needed. Finally, only Skullneck remained standing. He glared at Nathan, his chest heaving with fury. "You think this is over?" he spat, pulling a knife from his boot. Nathan's eyes flicked to the blade, his expression unreadable. "You don't want to do this." "Oh, I think I do," Skullneck snarled, lunging forward. Nathan stepped to the side, deflecting the attack with a swift movement of his arm. The knife clattered to the floor as Nathan twisted Skullneck's wrist, forcing him to his knees. The room fell silent, the only sound the labored breathing of the defeated bikers. Nathan leaned in close, his voice calm but laced with menace. "This is your last chance. Leave. Don't come back. And if I hear you've threatened anyone in this town again, I won't be so forgiving." Skullneck glared up at him, his pride and fury warring with the pain radiating from his wrist. Finally, he nodded, a reluctant, grudging motion. Nathan released him and stepped back. Skullneck scrambled to his feet, clutching his wrist as he backed toward the door. "You'll regret this," he spat, but the threat rang hollow. The bikers limped out of the cafe, their earlier bravado completely shattered. The roar of their engines faded into the distance, leaving behind an eerie silence. Nathan straightened his jacket, glancing around the room. The patrons stared at him, their expressions a mix of awe and gratitude. "You okay?" he asked the barista, his tone softening. She nodded, her hands still trembling. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Nathan gave a small nod, his gaze sweeping over the cafe one last time. The fight might be over, but his instincts told him this wasn't the end. People like Skullneck didn't take defeat lightly. As he walked back to his table and picked up his cup, his mind was already working, planning for what might come next. Trouble had a way of finding him, no matter how far he tried to run. And this time, he wasn't going to let it catch him off guard. Nathan returned to his seat, lifting the cappuccino he'd left untouched. He sipped it slowly, his face calm despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The quiet hum of conversation slowly returned to the cafe, though the air still felt charged, heavy with the echoes of the chaos. The barista approached cautiously, her hands wringing a towel. Are you some kind of cop?" she asked hesitantly. Nathan glanced up at her, his piercing gaze softening slightly. "No. Just a guy who doesn't like bullies." The simplicity of his answer struck her. She nodded, her lips pressing into a grateful smile. "Well, thank you. They've been coming here for months, scaring people, taking what they want. No one's ever stood up to them before." Nathan set his cup down and met her gaze. "They won't come back. Not for a while, at least." The barista looked skeptical but said nothing. She returned behind the counter, where whispers had already started among the staff and remaining patrons. Everyone was asking the same question: who was this man? Nathan stayed at the cafe a little longer, his sharp mind replaying the encounter. He was troubled not by the fight, but by what it signified. Bikers like these didn't just show up out of nowhere. They had a leader, a structure, and likely a reason for targeting this quiet little town. And if Skullneck and his gang were the bottom rung, Nathan knew the real threat hadn't revealed itself yet. As he left the cafe, the rookie biker's face lingered in his mind. Luke. He hadn't wanted to fight. Nathan had seen the hesitation, the doubt, and it intrigued him. Maybe there was more to the young man than the patch on his jacket suggested. Nathan took a circuitous route home, his instincts leading him to check his surroundings. The streets were quiet, the town bathed in the warm hues of the setting sun. But his gut told him the peace wouldn't last. Later that evening, Nathan sat in his modest home, a cabin tucked at the edge of town. He sifted through a wooden box on the table, pulling out an old phone. The device was outdated but secure, something he'd kept for emergencies. Tonight felt like one of those times. He dialed a number, waiting as the line clicked and a familiar voice answered on the other end. "Cole. Didn't think I'd hear from you again." "Didn't think I'd need to call," Nathan replied, his voice steady. "But I've got a situation." The man on the other end chuckled dryly. "You always do." "What kind of situation?" "Small gang causing trouble in a quiet town." "Typical muscle, but I think they're connected to something bigger." "Need backup?" "Not yet. Just information." "Look into a local crew. They might call themselves the Iron Fangs." There was a pause. "Iron Fangs? Haven't heard that name in a while." "They've been quiet for years. If they're resurfacing, it's not for small-time stuff." Nathan's jaw tightened. "That's what I'm worried about. Let me know what you find." "You got it? Stay sharp, Cole." Nathan ended the call and leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. The Iron Fangs weren't just a biker gang. Years ago, they'd been involved in smuggling, extortion, and arms dealing. If they were making moves in this town, it wasn't a coincidence. They had a purpose and Nathan intended to find out what it was. The following day, Nathan returned to the cafe. It was quieter than usual, the events of the previous day still fresh in everyone's minds. The barista greeted him with a small, nervous smile, and a few of the regulars nodded respectfully. Word had spread, and though no one approached him directly, he could feel the weight of their curiosity. As he sipped his coffee, a shadow fell across his table. Nathan looked up to see the rookie biker Luke standing there, shifting from foot to foot. His face was pale, and his eyes darted nervously around the room. "We need to talk," Luke said, his voice barely above a whisper. Nathan gestured to the seat across from him. "Go ahead." Luke hesitated before sitting, his hands fidgeting on the table. "Look, I didn't want to fight yesterday. But Skullneck, he doesn't take no for an answer. If you cross him, he loses," Nathan said bluntly. "Like he did yesterday." Luke's lips twitched into a brief smile, but it quickly faded. "Yeah, but he won't stop. He's not the type to let something like this go. And the Iron Fangs, they're bigger than you think." Nathan leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. "How big?" Luke glanced around nervously, lowering his voice. "They've got people everywhere. Connections in other towns, even cities. And the boss, the real boss, not Skullneck, he's dangerous. He's planning something big." "What kind of something?" Nathan pressed. "I don't know," Luke admitted, his shoulders slumping. "But I've heard them talking. About shipments, about people who need convincing. They're not just riding bikes and causing trouble, they're gearing up for something serious." Nathan studied Luke carefully. The young man was clearly out of his depth, and there was a genuine fear in his eyes. "Why are you telling me this?" Luke hesitated, his throat bobbing as he swallowed. "Because I'm done. I didn't sign up for this. When I joined, it was just supposed to be about the rides, the brotherhood. But now it's something else. And after what you did yesterday, I figured you might be able to help." Nathan leaned back, considering his options. Luke's information was valuable, but trusting him completely would be foolish. Still, the rookie might be the key to uncovering what the Iron Fangs were planning. "All right," Nathan said finally. "You want out? I'll help you. But you're going to tell me everything you know." Luke nodded quickly, relief washing over his face. "Anything. Just get me out of this mess." Nathan's lips pressed into a thin line. "We'll start with this, where's the Iron Fang's main base?" Luke's answer set the stage for the next chapter of the conflict. The Iron Fangs weren't just a threat to the town, they were part of something larger, something darker. And Nathan knew that if he didn't act soon, the consequences would be far-reaching. As he walked out of the cafe, the weight of the situation settled on his shoulders. The fight was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The air was electric, tension rippling through the gang as they processed what had just happened. Their leader, Skullneck, visibly bristled at the sight of the badge, his confidence wavering for the first time. "Experience." Skullneck scoffed, though his voice cracked slightly. "What are you, some kind of washed-up cop?" Jack Nathan Cole didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a measured step forward, his gaze never leaving Skullneck's. His calm demeanor was unnerving, each movement deliberate, each word carefully chosen. "I'm the guy who walked away from things you can't imagine," Nathan said quietly, his voice carrying an edge that cut through the bravado. "But if you push me, I'll remind you why I left in the first place." The gang exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier swagger giving way to uncertainty. One of them, Luke, the rookie biker, looked particularly pale, his eyes darting between Nathan and the others. He knew what was coming, and it was far beyond anything they were prepared for. The leader snarled, trying to reassert control. "I don't care who you are. This town is ours, and you just made the worst mistake of your life." Nathan smirked faintly, his eyes narrowing. "You're not the first to say that. And you won't be the last." With a growl, Skullneck lunged, swinging a heavy fist. Nathan sidestepped with practiced ease, catching the man's arm and twisting it sharply. The crack of bone was sickening, and Skullneck dropped to his knees with a howl of pain. Before the rest of the gang could react, Nathan moved with the precision of a predator. He disarmed another biker, using the man's own chain against him, sending him crashing into the ground. A third came at him with a crowbar, but Nathan ducked under the swing and delivered a sharp elbow to his ribs, leaving him gasping for air. The scene was chaos, but Nathan was calm, methodical. Every movement was efficient, every strike calculated. His years of training surfaced effortlessly, each action a reminder of the life he once led. By the time the dust settled, 4 bikers were on the ground, groaning in pain. The remaining 2, including Luke, stood frozen, unsure whether to flee or fight. Nathan turned to them, his expression unreadable. "You've got a choice," he said, his voice low but commanding. "Walk away now, or end up like them." Luke didn't hesitate. He dropped his weapon, a rusted wrench, and stepped back, his hands raised in surrender. The other biker hesitated, his jaw clenched, before finally tossing his knife to the ground and following suit. Nathan's eyes lingered on Luke, studying him. "You made the right call," he said, his tone softer now. "But this doesn't end here. The Iron Fangs are done in this town. Pass the message along." The quiet was deafening as Nathan turned his attention back to Skullneck, who was cradling his broken arm and glaring up at him with a mixture of pain and fury. You think this is over?" Skullneck spat. "You don't know who you're messing with." Nathan crouched down, meeting the man's eyes. "Oh, I know exactly who I'm messing with. And I know your boss isn't going to like hearing how you got beaten by a guy drinking coffee at a gas station." Skullneck's face twisted with rage, but he said nothing. Nathan straightened, pulling out his phone. He dialed a number and spoke briefly, his words clipped and professional. "Sheriff. Got a situation at the gas station. Send a couple of cars." The sound of sirens in the distance broke the stillness, and Nathan stepped away, letting the authorities handle the aftermath. As the bikers were rounded up, Luke lingered near the edge of the lot, his face conflicted. Nathan approached him, his steps deliberate but unthreatening. "You've got a lot to think about," he said simply. "What you do next matters." Luke nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want any of this. I didn't know it would get this bad." Nathan's expression softened slightly. "Then fix it. You've got a chance to walk away. Take it." As the police loaded the gang into their cars, the sheriff approached Nathan, his brow furrowed. "Care to explain what happened here?" Nathan gave a faint smile. "Just a misunderstanding. They thought they could run this town. I helped them see otherwise." The sheriff snorted, though there was a hint of admiration in his tone. "You've got a knack for trouble, don't you?" Nathan shrugged. "Trouble has a way of finding me." That evening, Nathan sat on his porch, the quiet of the town slowly returning. He knew the Iron Fangs wouldn't take this lightly. There would be repercussions, retaliation. But for now, the town was safe, and that was enough. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Nathan allowed himself a moment of reflection. He'd walked away from his old life, seeking peace. But sometimes, peace came at a price. And if it meant standing up to protect what mattered, Nathan was willing to pay it. Because that's who he was. Not just a man with a past, but a man who refused to let the darkness win. Nathan sat on the edge of the gas station curb, watching as the sheriff's deputies loaded the last of the bikers into their squad cars. Skullneck was still gritting his teeth, defiance in his eyes despite the obvious pain in his arm. His gang had been utterly dismantled in minutes, and the humiliation burned hotter than the physical injuries. The sirens began to fade, leaving behind an odd stillness. The patrons, who had quietly gathered at the edges of the scene, now cautiously approached Nathan. Whispers of admiration and curiosity filled the air. "Who is this guy?" a man muttered to his wife. "I thought he was just some loner," another woman said, her voice tinged with awe. Nathan, unfazed by the murmurs, adjusted his leather jacket and stepped back into the cafe. The staff looked at him with a mix of gratitude and unease, unsure how to address the man who had just single-handedly neutralized one of the town's most feared gangs. As Nathan returned to his seat, a soft thank you came from behind the counter. The barista, a young woman who had been frozen in fear moments ago, was now pouring him another cup of coffee. "I didn't do it for thanks," Nathan replied calmly, his eyes scanning the street outside once more. "But you're welcome." He accepted the cup, but his hand lingered on it for a moment. The fight hadn't taken a toll physically, he was far too trained for that, but mentally, something had shifted. He hadn't meant to reveal himself so openly. He had been careful for years, staying out of sight and out of trouble, blending into small towns like this one. But trouble had come knocking, and his instincts had kicked in before he could think twice. As he sat there, sipping his coffee, a shadow fell over the table. It was Luke, the young biker who had hesitated to attack. Nathan raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything, waiting for the boy to speak. Luke shifted uncomfortably, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. I just wanted to say," Luke stammered, looking anywhere but directly at Nathan. "I didn't want any of this. I swear. I just..." Nathan held up a hand, cutting him off. "You're young. You made a mistake. What matters now is what you do next." Luke nodded rapidly, relief washing over his face. "I'm done with them," he said firmly. "After tonight, I'm out. I didn't know it would get this bad." Nathan's gaze softened slightly, though his tone remained steady. "Good. But don't just leave. Fix what you've broken. Find a way to make things right." Luke hesitated, then nodded again. "I will." With that, the boy turned and walked away, his figure disappearing into the night. The cafe door jingled as the sheriff entered, his hat in hand. He was a stocky man with a no-nonsense demeanor, but even he seemed taken aback by the scene earlier. He walked over to Nathan's table and gestured to the chair across from him. "Mind if I sit?" Nathan shrugged, and the sheriff took the seat, setting his hat on the table. "You know," the sheriff began, leaning forward, "I've been trying to get those iron fangs out of my town for months. Then you show up, and in 10 minutes, they're all in cuffs." "I didn't plan it that way," Nathan replied, his tone even. The sheriff chuckled dryly. "Could have fooled me. I don't know who you are, but you're not just some drifter. Guys like you don't just stumble into small towns like this without a reason." Nathan said nothing, letting the silence hang in the air. The sheriff studied him for a moment, then leaned back. "Well," the sheriff said, standing up, "whoever you are, you've got my thanks. But don't think this is over. The Iron Fangs have friends, bigger ones. And they don't take kindly to losing." As the sheriff left, Nathan's mind was already racing. He knew the sheriff was right. The Iron Fangs were part of a larger network, and their boss wouldn't let this defeat slide. Nathan had dealt with their type before, men who thrived on power and fear, who couldn't let a challenge go unanswered. He sighed, finishing his coffee. This quiet town was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place to escape from the ghosts of his past. But it seemed his past had followed him here, whether he liked it or not. The next day, the tension in the town was palpable. News of the fight had spread like wildfire, and the townsfolk were on edge, knowing that retaliation was inevitable. Nathan walked through the streets, his presence commanding quiet respect. People nodded at him, whispered words of thanks, but he kept moving, his focus elsewhere. In the back of his mind, he was already preparing. He knew the Iron Fangs would regroup, and they wouldn't come alone this time. They'd bring reinforcements, heavier firepower, and a thirst for revenge. Nathan had faced worse odds before, but this time, it wasn't just his life on the line. The town was in danger, and whether they knew it or not, they were depending on him. That night, Nathan sat on his porch, cleaning a set of knives he hadn't touched in years. The moonlight glinted off the blades as he worked, his movements precise and practiced. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he wasn't going to run from one either. As he stared out into the darkness, his thoughts drifted back to his old life, the missions, the betrayals, the reasons he had left it all behind. He had chosen peace, but peace, it seemed, wasn't ready to choose him. He sheathed the knives and stood, his resolve solidifying. If the Iron Fangs wanted a fight, they'd find one waiting for them. And this time, he wouldn't be holding back. The sound of the approaching sirens grew louder, but for Nathan, the brief moment of silence after the chaos was almost comforting. The adrenaline in his veins began to subside, leaving behind a quiet calmness. The gang of bikers, once so full of menace and pride, was now reduced to a disorganized mess of broken bodies and bruised egos. As the police cars pulled into the parking lot, their flashing lights bathing the scene in red and blue, the sound of heavy boots on gravel echoed through the air. The deputies moved in with precision, securing the area and handcuffing the remaining bikers who hadn't already made a break for it. Skullneck, still clutching his broken arm, shot Nathan a hateful glare. His pride was crumbling, his carefully constructed image as a tough, untouchable gang leader shattered in front of everyone. His gang was defeated, and there was nothing left but humiliation. "You, who are you?" Skullneck spat, his voice filled with venom and disbelief. He had been a powerful figure in this town, feared by the locals, but now he was nothing more than a wounded animal, at the mercy of a man who had outclassed him with ease. Nathan didn't respond right away. He took a slow, deliberate sip from his coffee, letting the moment stretch longer than necessary. He had all the time in the world to savor his quiet victory, to enjoy the fact that his instincts had been right and that he had acted just in time. When he finally set the cup down, the sound of porcelain against wood was almost as sharp as the words he spoke. "Just a guy who doesn't like bullies," Nathan said, his voice low and calm, but edged with a quiet intensity. The officer who had approached Nathan, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a weathered face, gave him a knowing look. He had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize the quiet power in Nathan's demeanor. The man was no ordinary civilian, there was something deeper, something that made him stand out among the crowd. The officer smirked, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "You're telling me," he said, glancing at Skullneck and his gang, "that all of this was just because you don't like bullies?" Nathan's eyes met the officer's. "That's right. But I don't mind finishing what they started." The officer chuckled to himself. "Should have done your homework, pal." He motioned toward Nathan. "This is Nathan Cole, Medal of Honor recipient, and one of the finest soldiers I've ever had the privilege of serving with. You just messed with the wrong guy." The words hit Skullneck like a slap in the face. His eyes widened, the recognition slowly dawning on him. Nathan's name had carried weight in certain circles, but Skullneck had been too blinded by arrogance to know who he was really dealing with. And now, standing there in front of the broken gang leader, Nathan's past was no longer a secret. His skills, his experience, and his quiet authority had all come to light. Skullneck's gaze shifted between Nathan and the officer, his face twisting in a mixture of anger and fear. You're the guy from the war, the one they all talked about." His voice faltered. "You're supposed to be just a has-been. A ghost." Nathan's lips curved into a small, humorless smile. "Maybe I am a ghost. But ghosts still have teeth." As the last of the bikers were hauled away in the back of police vehicles, Nathan remained standing, his posture relaxed but attentive. He had done his part, and now, it was up to the town and the law to take over. The bikers were headed for jail, and that was where they belonged. Skullneck and his gang were a cancer in this place, and now they were being cut out. But there was no sense of triumph in Nathan's heart, only the quiet satisfaction that justice had been done. He didn't need accolades or attention. He didn't want to be a hero. He just wanted peace. A peace that, in his experience, could only be found through action. The sheriff, who had been quietly observing from a distance, approached Nathan after the chaos had settled. His face was serious, but there was a hint of respect in his eyes. "You sure know how to handle a situation," the sheriff said, his voice gruff but not unappreciative. "I've dealt with bikers before, but none of them ever went down like this." Nathan gave him a simple nod. "Sometimes, the best way to deal with a bully is to show them you're not afraid of them." The sheriff studied him for a moment longer before extending his hand. "Well, I'll be damned. I thought I knew all the troublemakers in this town. I didn't expect to meet someone who could bring down a gang in under 10 minutes. Nathan shook the sheriff's hand firmly but without fanfare. "I'm not here to make trouble. I'm here to make sure there's no more of it." The sheriff stepped back, his eyes scanning the aftermath of the night's events. His tone softened as he addressed Nathan one last time. "I owe you one, Cole. The people in this town, they won't forget what you did." Nathan paused, his gaze drifting toward the horizon as the first light of dawn began to break. It had been a long night, and the town would carry the scars of this event for a while. But the bikers were gone, and the town was free for now. "I didn't do it for thanks," Nathan replied quietly. "But I'm glad the town's safe." The sheriff nodded. "Safe for now, at least. But you've got a target on your back now, you know. The Iron Fangs don't take defeat lightly." Nathan didn't respond, but his eyes hardened slightly. He had known that the gang's leader would not accept defeat easily. It was only a matter of time before the retaliation came, and he would be ready for it. But for now, he'd earned his peace. For now, this was enough. As the sheriff walked back toward his patrol car, Nathan took one last look around. The town was still. The sun was rising, and the quiet hum of daily life was beginning to resume. But in the back of his mind, Nathan was already planning for what might come next. He had been a soldier, a protector, once. And even though he'd left that life behind, a part of him could never escape it. He was always prepared, always watching, always ready to step in when things went wrong. It was the price of peace, he thought, never truly being able to walk away. And so, as he stood there, watching the town slowly come back to life, Nathan Cole made a silent promise to himself: if the Iron Fangs or anyone came back, he'd be ready. He'd always be ready. As the hours passed, the news of the bikers' capture spread. People in the town began to talk, the whispers filled with gratitude and awe for the man who had single-handedly taken down the notorious gang. But there were still many questions about Nathan's past, about who he really was, and what had brought him to this quiet town in the first place. The truth was, Nathan was a mystery to most people. He had no interest in revealing his past, no desire to relieve the things he had done before. What mattered was that he had made the town safer, and in his own way, that was enough. As Nathan sat on the porch of his small house later that evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he reflected on the day's events. It had been a brutal reminder that peace was fragile, and sometimes, it took a man like him to protect it. But he also knew one thing for certain: the town was safer now, and for the first time in a long time, Nathan felt a sense of peace settle in his chest. Whether it would last, he didn't know. But for now, it was enough. And that was all he needed. The air was cooler now, the morning light softening the sharp edges of the world. The chaos had passed, and all that was left was the quiet hum of the town beginning its slow return to normalcy. Nathan stepped out of the cafe, his boots making a soft tap-tap on the worn wooden floor. For a brief moment, the town seemed peaceful again, almost as if nothing had happened. The cafe owner, a small woman with graying hair and an apron that looked like it had seen better days, hesitated by the counter. She had been watching everything unfold, her hands still shaking slightly from the shock of what she had witnessed. She wasn't used to this kind of violence, or this kind of hero. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Most people wouldn't have done what you did. Not for strangers. Not for anyone." Nathan looked at her, his expression unreadable at first, but then he gave her a small, almost imperceptible smile. It wasn't a smile of pride, or satisfaction, but of understanding. "Most people don't have to," he replied quietly. "Most people don't get pushed to the edge like that. But when they do, they usually have a choice. And I made mine." The cafe owner blinked, taking in his words. She could see that Nathan wasn't the kind of man who enjoyed being noticed. He wasn't the kind of man who wanted to be celebrated for what he had done. For him, it was simply about doing what was right, no matter how small or big the task might seem. Nathan took another slow sip from his coffee, the warmth of the mug comforting against his hand. The cafe owner wanted to say more, maybe thank him again, but something in Nathan's steady gaze told her that he didn't need her gratitude. It was enough to know that things were going to be different now, safer, quieter. That was the kind of reward he valued. Without another word, Nathan turned and made his way to the door. As he stepped outside, the cool breeze hit his face, carrying with it the scent of fresh-cut grass and the faint sounds of the world waking up. He didn't look back at the cafe. He never did. His job was done. But as he walked down the sidewalk, he couldn't help but notice the way the townspeople looked at him now. The whispers began again, but this time, they weren't laced with fear or suspicion. There was something different in the way they spoke: respect, admiration, awe. They didn't know his past. They didn't know the weight of the life he had lived. But they knew what he had done, and that was enough. One by one, the people who had once looked past him, ignored him, or judged him from afar were now watching him with a new sense of recognition. They didn't need to know his history to understand that he had made a difference. Nathan Cole had reminded them all that, sometimes, a single act of courage can change the course of everything. As he continued down the street, his pace steady and purposeful, Nathan couldn't help but think about the day's events. About the bikers, the chaos, and the moment when everything had seemed to shift. In that brief instant, when he had stood his ground and taken action, it had been as if the weight of the world had shifted just enough for the town to breathe again. But even as the adrenaline of the confrontation faded, Nathan knew that this kind of peace was always fragile. The bikers had been dealt with for now, but there would always be others, always someone willing to push boundaries and take control. The world, it seemed, was never truly at peace. It was always on the brink of chaos, and it was up to people like Nathan to tip the balance in favor of calm. The thought wasn't a burden, though. It wasn't something that weighed him down or made him bitter. He had made his choice long ago, when he had chosen to serve. And now, even in retirement, he could never fully escape the sense of duty that had always driven him. It wasn't about being a hero. It wasn't about seeking recognition or glory. It was about knowing when to act, when to stand tall and firm, and when to remind people that kindness and peace didn't come for free. Sometimes, they had to be fought for. Nathan paused at the corner of the street, his gaze drifting across the small town that now seemed quieter, safer. The rising sun bathed the buildings in a warm, golden light, and the gentle sound of the wind rustled the leaves on the trees. It was a moment of calm, a rare and precious thing. As he stood there, taking in the stillness, a young woman approached him from the opposite direction. She was about his age, her face familiar. She was one of the locals, someone who had probably been watching the entire scene from a distance. When she reached him, she stopped, hesitating for a moment, as though she wasn't sure whether she should speak to him. "You saved us," she said softly, her voice almost shy. "I don't know how you did it, but thank you." Nathan gave her a quick nod, his eyes softening for just a moment. "You don't need to thank me," he said quietly. "Just remember that peace doesn't come easy. It's up to all of us to keep it. The woman looked at him, her eyes filled with a kind of wonder, before she nodded and turned to walk away. Nathan watched her for a moment, then continued on his own path, the weight of her words lingering in the air. It wasn't the first time he had been thanked, but there was something different in the way she had said it. She wasn't thanking him for his bravery or for fighting back. She was thanking him for something deeper, something intangible. It was the kind of gratitude that came not from a specific action, but from the knowledge that someone, somewhere, was willing to stand in the gap when things went wrong. The kind of gratitude that didn't rely on rewards or recognition, but on the quiet understanding that peace was a fragile thing, something that had to be protected, even when it seemed like no one was watching. As Nathan made his way down the street, the day continued to unfold around him. The town was waking up, the world turning again. But for just a moment, he felt the weight of his actions settle on him like a warm, comforting blanket. This town, this small, quiet place, had been saved not by force, but by courage, by a willingness to stand up for what was right. And as the whispers of gratitude and awe filled the air, Nathan felt something shift within him. It wasn't pride. It wasn't glory. It was a quiet sense of peace, of knowing that sometimes, the quietest corner of a room held the loudest story. Those who underestimated the wrong person? They were the ones who never saw it coming. As the sun rose higher in the sky, Nathan Cole continued walking, his pace steady, his mind already turning to whatever might come next. Because even though this chapter had ended, he knew better than anyone that peace never lasted forever. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that, for now, he had made a difference. And that was enough.